Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that you might not think is very interesting, but trust me, it's actually super fascinating. We're going to be talking about zoning, like literally what gets built where. You ever drive through a city and wonder why you see, there's this area with only houses and then suddenly there's like a whole bunch of shops and restaurants and stuff. Yeah, that's zoning at work. So for this deep dive, we've got some really great sources. We've got a review of this book, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. And we've also got an article that looks at how zoning impacts development financially. And then we've got another piece that talks about how zoning affects rural areas, not just cities, which I thought was pretty interesting. So our mission, if you will, is to really figure out this whole zoning thing. How does it work? Where did it come from? And how does it impact things like how much our houses cost or even what small towns look like. So before we go too far, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. What exactly is zoning?
So zoning is basically setting the rules for how we use land. It determines whether a specific piece of land can have a house on it or a store, a factory, or even a park.
So it's like a tool that city planners use to shape what a city looks like.
Yeah, exactly. And this book review actually had a really good example from Conway, Arkansas that kind of shows this. They even encourage readers to pull up their own city's zoning map, which I thought was pretty cool. They talk about how Conway has these zoning maps that divide the city into different districts. It's kind of like color coding sections on a map. Each color or district has its own rules about what can be built there.
So if I wanted to open a bakery in an area that's zoned for just single-family homes, I might not be able to, huh?
Yeah, probably not. That's the idea behind those R1 zones they talk about in the review. They're specifically for single-family homes. And zoning rules can get super specific, too. They can say how big your lot has to be, how tall your building can be, even how far back from the street you have to build.
Wow, so it's not just okay, houses go here, stores go there. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, way more. All these rules are written down in these things called zoning ordinances. And the book review mentions that these things can be hundreds or even thousands of pages long.
Yikes.
Yeah, not exactly a light read, but it shows how complex zoning can be.
Yeah, I can imagine. So are these kinds of zoning rules pretty common then?
Oh yeah, super common. The review says that in a lot of cities, something like 75% to 90% of land is zoned just for single-family homes.
Wow, that's a lot. I wonder if having that much land just for houses impacts what kinds of housing gets built and how much it costs.
Oh, absolutely it does. If most of the land is for single-family homes, it limits how many apartments or townhouses can be built. And when there's not much of something and a lot of people want it, the price goes up.
Yeah, makes sense. Supply and demand.
Yeah.
But are there any cities that do things differently? Is this strict zoning the only way to do it?
There are definitely cities that try different things. The most famous example is probably Houston, Texas.
Oh yeah, Houston. They're famous for doing things their own way, right? No zoning.
Yep, Houston's the largest city in the U.S. that doesn't have traditional zoning. But that doesn't mean they have no rules at all. They use things like deed restrictions more.
Okay, so not a total free-for-all. What are these deed restrictions then?
Basically, they're agreements written into the deed of a property that limit what you can do with that land. They're often put in place by developers when a neighborhood is first built.
So instead of the city making the rules, it's more like agreements between property owners.
Exactly. These agreements can cover all sorts of things, like what kind of architecture you can have, what materials you can use to build, even what kinds of businesses can be in the area.
Interesting. So it's like a more, I guess you could say, local or community-driven approach to zoning. But are there any downsides to doing things the Houston way?
Well, some people say that without zoning, you can get unpredictable development. And it might lead to more conflict between neighbors who have different visions for their community.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's pretty amazing how zoning, which seems like a technical thing, can lead to all these different opinions and debates.
It really is. And it's not just about those debates either. Zoning has a big impact on how much it costs to develop things. The book review talks about a study that found this thing they call a zoning tax.
The zoning tax. Oh, that doesn't sound good.
It's basically a way to measure how much zoning rules drive up housing costs. And the study found some pretty big differences between cities.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. San Francisco and New York City, their housing costs are through the roof because of zoning. But places like Cincinnati and Dallas, it didn't seem to affect them as much.
Right. And that leads to the question, why does zoning seem to hit some places harder than others?
Yeah, good question.
It's complicated, but it probably depends on a few things.
Like how strict the zoning rules are, and how much demand there is for housing in the area, and how much land there actually is to build new houses.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
And you know what? We often think of zoning as something that only affects cities. But this article we have from Smart Growth America, they say that zoning matters a lot in rural areas too, maybe even more so. Why is that? Why is zoning so important in rural areas?
Well, zoning can really shape what a rural town looks like and how well its economy does.
So for those rural areas that are trying to hold on to that small town feel, how does zoning come into play?
It's kind of interesting. Sometimes zoning rules in rural areas are actually what cause sprawl.
Really? I thought zoning was supposed to stop sprawl.
I know, right? But when zoning rules make you have really big lots for houses or put limits on what kinds of housing you can build, it actually forces development to happen farther away from the town center. And then you end up with these sprawling developments that are expensive for the town to maintain, and they eat up valuable farmland in the process.
So instead of having everything close together, zoning ends up making things spread out more.
Yeah, pretty much. And that can hurt those nice main streets you see in small towns. When zoning makes it hard to have houses, businesses, and shops all within walking distance, it can contribute to those downtowns dying out.
It's like they were trying to do the right thing, but it ended up having the opposite effect, especially if those rules haven't been updated in a while.
Yeah, definitely.
No, it sounds like rural communities need to rethink their zoning rules.
Absolutely. The article suggests that they should encourage more mixed-use development, like having a mix of housing, businesses, and community spaces all closer together.
So zoning could actually help those small towns stay economically strong and keep that sense of community that people like.
Exactly. And it's not just rural areas either. More and more people are talking about changing zoning in both urban and rural places.
What kinds of changes are people talking about?
One big one is getting rid of single-family zoning altogether, or at least cutting back on it a lot.
Wow, that's a pretty big change.
It is, but like we were talking about before, having all that single-family zoning can make housing more expensive, and it can make it harder for people to find a place they can afford.
So by allowing more types of housing, you can make housing cheaper and accessible to more people.
Right. And it's not just about building more apartments either. It's about encouraging what they call missing middle housing.
Missing middle housing. What's that?
It's basically the types of housing that are in between a single-family home and a big apartment building, like duplexes, triplexes, or even small clusters of cottages. That kind of housing can be more affordable, and it often fits better into existing neighborhoods.
So you get more variety without having to build these huge apartment blocks.
Exactly.
So it's about making communities more diverse and affordable, but without changing their character too much.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that zoning isn't just about rules and regulations. It really affects people's lives.
Yeah, it affects where people can afford to live, what their communities look like, and even how they interact with their neighbors.
It affects everything from jobs and transportation to what kinds of businesses are around.
So it's really about what kind of communities we want to build,
Yeah.
how we use zoning to do that.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, this thing, zoning, it seems kind of boring, but it actually has a huge impact on our lives.
It really does. You know, it can even affect things like if you have a park nearby, or if you can walk to the grocery store, or if you can even afford to live in a certain area.
Right. In the book review, they said that understanding zoning can be a radicalizing experience.
Radicalizing, that's a strong word.
Yeah, but think about it. When you see how these lines drawn on a map can really affect people's lives and whole communities, it makes you question things, you know? Like, maybe things should be different.
It's like you suddenly see how things really work, and it can be kind of shocking. But okay, let's talk about solutions. If we want to have communities that are fairer, more sustainable, more lively, how do we get there? What can we actually do to change zoning?
Well, one idea that's getting popular is something called form-based codes.
Form-based codes. I'm not familiar with that.
It's a different way of approaching zoning. Instead of saying exactly what can be built on a piece of land, form-based codes focus more on how buildings should look and feel. Like, they might say how tall buildings can be, how far back from the street they need to be, or what materials you can use to build them. But they're more flexible about what you can actually do in those buildings.
So instead of saying only houses on this block, it's more about making sure everything looks and feels a certain way.
Exactly. The goal is to create places where people can walk around easily, where you have a mix of homes, businesses, and public spaces.
So you can live, work, and hang out all in the same area. That sounds like a good way to build a sense of community. Are there any examples of form-based codes working well in real life?
There are actually quite a few. One famous example is Seaside, Florida.
Seaside. That's one of those planned communities, right? Like designed to have that old-timey small-town vibe.
That's the one. Seaside was one of the first places in the U.S. to really use form-based codes. They wanted to create a town center that felt like it had grown naturally over time, with a mix of housing types, shops, and public spaces all close together.
So it's not just about controlling what gets built, but also about creating a certain atmosphere.
Exactly.
And Seaside has been successful, right?
Yeah, a lot of other communities are looking to Seaside as an example of how to use form-based codes to make places more walkable and mixed use.
It's amazing how zoning, which seems like this technical detail, can really change how a whole community feels.
It really is.
What about other ways to reform zoning? Are there any other ideas out there?
Another reform that's gaining traction is by right development, especially for certain types of housing.
By right development. Okay, explain that one to me.
Basically, it means that if a developer follows a specific set of rules, like about building height, how many units they can build, and design standards, then they're automatically allowed to build without having to go through a long approval process.
So it makes things easier and faster for developers.
Yeah, it cuts down on the bureaucracy, which can help get more housing built, especially affordable housing.
That makes a lot of sense.
And this isn't just about cities either. Rural areas need zoning codes that work for them too, like the article mentioned, protecting farmland, revitalizing their main streets, and having different housing options.
So it seems like all these issues we've been talking about, affordability, equity, sustainability, they're all tied to zoning, whether we're talking about cities or rural areas.
They really are. And as we understand those connections better, we can make smarter choices about how we want our communities to be.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into zoning, is there anything that really stuck out to you? Like any fact or idea that you found particularly interesting?
I think for me, it was that line from the book review about understanding zoning being like a radicalizing experience. It really drives home the point that zoning, which can seem so technical and boring, actually gets at the heart of what we value as communities.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these aren't just, rules on a piece of paper. They have real consequences for people.
I love that the book encourages readers to look up their city's zoning map. It's such a simple thing, but it makes it real. You can see how these regulations are playing out right where you live.
It's like taking something abstract and making it concrete. Seeing those lines on a map and how they shape your actual neighborhood. One of the things that really struck me during this deep dive was how zoning can have these unintended consequences.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Like those zoning rules that were supposed to preserve rural areas but ended up causing sprawl.
Yeah, or how zoning can sometimes make housing less affordable, even though the goal was to create stable neighborhoods.
It shows that these issues are really complex and there are often trade-offs to consider. And we have to be open to trying new things like those form-based codes and by right development models we talked about.
It's exciting to see these new ideas being explored. It feels like we're moving away from these rigid top-down rules and towards systems that are more flexible and can adapt to what different communities need.
Don't be afraid to dig in. Check out that book, Arbitrary Lines. Look at your city's zoning map. See how these rules are playing out in your own backyard.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into zoning. We hope you learned something new and that you're feeling inspired to learn more and maybe even get involved. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep shaping the world around you.